Welcome to the EnsoReal Paradigm Shifters podcast. This show is for and about the entrepreneurs who work to improve and expand our human well-being by bringing cutting-edge technologies and ideas to life. We are Marie and Magnus Dahlgren, your hosts. In this episode, we talk to Tatiana Kassessinoff. Tatiana received her PhD in chemistry in the early 90s. During her post-doctoral work at the National Institute of Health, she realized that bench science was not her path. And after moving to Germany, spent over 20 years as a consultant to biotech companies and scientific academic institutions. On moving back to the United Kingdom in 2015, she retrained as a hypnotherapist to pursue her interest in the mind-body connection and now broadcasts regularly on the subject in her own podcast called London Heal. And now, here is our conversation with Tatiana Kassessinoff.
Hello.
Hello. Hi,
Hello.
Marie. Hi.
Nice to see you again.
Hello.
Hi, we haven't met, so I'm
Yes.
Tatiana.
I'm Marie, and Magnus is my husband, and he's also a co-host of our podcast. That's why we're both here today.
Great.
First of all, I would like to say thank you once again that you're here. And we have this opportunity to make this episode with you, this interview. And the first question is, how would you want to be introduced to our listeners? Tell a little bit more about yourself so they know.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Pleasure is all mine. How does one want to be introduced? It's always a difficult question. So I'm a scientist by training. And I spent many years working in the business aspect of science, so supporting biotechnology companies and research institutions.
Yeah.
But I've always had a passion for mind-body medicine. And when I moved back to the UK a couple of years back, I decided to take that as an opportunity to delve further into my interests. So I retrained as a hypnotherapist because I thought if you're going to have a look at how the mind works, that's probably a good place to start. So that's really where I'm at the moment, is trying to investigate mind, body, spirit medicine, because I think this is truly the way forwards. And I also now run a podcast exactly on that topic. And so that's me in a nutshell.
That's interesting. And it's even more interesting that you started like a scientist. And eventually, you're a hypnotherapist. And can you please tell a little bit more about this body-mind-spirit connection and why it's so important in medicine? Because in traditional classic approach in medicine, we have pretty much only body.
That's exactly right. Yeah, René Descartes, of course, is the person to blame for that, for separating mind and body. Probably because mind was way too complicated, and with the approaches they had back in those days, it was easier to separate it out. And it came from avoiding a conflict with the church, of course, which was then responsible for the mind aspect. But nobody ever told a body that it wasn't connected to the mind. And I think to argue that point is pretty redundant. One of the things that struck me very, very early in my career is that if you look at any kind of medical studies or clinical drug studies, you always have to control against a placebo, and that was always discarded as a sort of an inconvenient side effect, but it always struck me as actually being the most important part. So why does the placebo effect work? That means that a person receiving a drug or a treatment, even knowing that they're receiving potentially a placebo drug or treatment, will still in some cases respond, and oftentimes respond as much, if not more so, than the actual drug that's being tested. So I don't think this is something that anybody can refute. And in fact, I think a lot of pharmaceutical companies these days are actually going back to explore the placebo effect much more closely, because there's definitely something to it. And in my own dealings with clients, especially since I became a hypnotherapist, I've realized that you can optimize your body with the right diet, exercise, whatever. But if this up here is not in tune, if your mind isn't on board, then you can do all of these things until you're blue in the face. Sometimes it actually doesn't make any difference. And the mind, in my opinion, is actually probably the strongest driving force. And then we can start getting onto the whole story of epigenetics, where we know that our environment controls even our gene expression. And so I think most modern scientists begrudgingly would have to even admit these days that there is a connection, even if they're still convinced that consciousness is generated by the brain. At least they understand and are beginning to accept that the mind and the body are definitely interactive.
That's interesting. And why did you choose hypnotherapy? Because there are different approaches to integrate mind, body, and spirit.
There's a million different approaches. And I think the one thing you discover when you start this work is that it's never a one size fits all. Everybody responds to things in different ways. I chose it simply because it's an absolute, fast track to the subconscious. And the subconscious is clearly where a lot of programs are stored that we develop and acquire through early childhood. There's a lot of evidence now to prove that things like adverse childhood events can have very, very significant effects on us as adults, and not only on our psyche, but also on our physical well-being. Yeah. So that was the reason why I chose it, because it struck me as being an easy way and a fast-track way to get into the subconscious. But you're absolutely right. There's a myriad of different approaches. That's just the one I chose.
That's interesting. Thank you very much. And I have a question. What would be the most often request from your clients? So they come with certain problems in mind, body, or soul or spirit. So what would be the most frequent request for you?
Well, of course, because of my interest in physical body well-being as well as in mental well-being, a lot of my clients come with actual physical conditions. And oftentimes they're conditions where there's clearly a psychological component, and sometimes, strangely enough, it's really not clear, but still sorting that out will actually clear up a physical problem. It's really interesting. And those physical problems can be very diverse. It can be some autoimmune diseases come up, things like pain, arthritis, rheumatoid arthritis, those sorts of things are the most common. Migraines, back pain, exactly. And pain is something which is known to respond very, very positively to hypnotherapy. Another thing is gut problems, IBS. The gut-brain connection is something that we're just beginning to really appreciate and understand. The gut, in fact, has the largest number of neurons outside the brain, and that's why it's known as the second brain. Exactly, and the communication is really quite apparent. In fact, for IBS, hypnotherapy is now one of the recommended therapies for that condition. Other than that, oftentimes I will see clients who have issues with anxiety and depression, feelings of self-worth, people who kind of know that there's a problem somewhere, but they just don't know what that problem is. There's something that's stopping them from moving forwards, either in their lives in general, their professional development, their personal development, or sometimes, as I said, just their physical well-being. I think we often recognize that sometimes there's a problem. We feel almost like there's a block. And hypnotherapy can be a very effective way to identify and remove those blocks.
Interesting.
What are some misconceptions about hypnotherapy?
There's a lot of misconceptions, of course, generated by the media and movies. So the first misconception is you cannot be hypnotized unless you wish to be. It's a process that is voluntary. You have to go with the therapist or hypnotist that's working with you. And some people are clearly more suggestible than others, but you will never, ever be able to be made to do something you don't want to do. So that very classical picture of the person running across the stage like a clucking chicken, that person probably has something inside them that's a little bit exhibitionistic, or that they don't have those kind of restraints that other people might have to behaving like that in public. Because if that goes against your fundamental morals and values, a hypnotist will never be able to do that. And the way I can actually prove that is, if it were really possible, then every hypnotist on this planet would probably be driving a Ferrari and having millions of pounds, because they would have gotten their clients to give them all their money. So that doesn't work. So I think that's the biggest misconception, that you can do something that you don't want to do, or that thoughts can be implanted in your mind which you don't want to have. You have to be receptive to this. You don't have to believe it, but you have to go with the process.
Yes, thank you very much for your answer. And how do you think, what are the roots of anxiety and depression in adults?
Well, I think that's multifactorial. I think anything that is involved with mental and physical well-being these days is probably coming from a variety of sources. We're complex beings and we lead complex lives. However, the cases of depression and anxiety are massively increasing, and I think obviously media is an issue. We have a whole load of things that we are told to worry about.
Okay.
And people do, and depression and anxiety are almost two sides of the same coin. Depression is oftentimes being sunk in something that happened in the past, in events that happened in the past, in feelings that were generated in the past, and you experience a sense of helplessness and hopelessness, of being able to break this old pattern, this prison of thinking or feeling that you're in. And anxiety is kind of the other side of that, which is it's a fear of the future. And that sort of makes an incredible amount of sense, because our minds, the primary goal of the mind is to make sure that you survive. And therefore, it's the most extraordinary predictive machine. It will view anything that you're going through in your life. It will try and predict potential outcomes. And in fact, almost always the worst possible outcome, so that you can survive that. And so anxiety is a kind of falling prey to this mechanism, which was originally set up as a very effective survival mechanism. But now we're not being challenged by the saber-toothed tiger or the bear or frostbite or whatever. It's road rage, or it's the bank account is empty and the mortgage needs to be paid. And these mechanisms are triggered in exactly the same way. So anxiety is a sort of a fear of the future. But the irony of that is that those fears of the future are also rooted in your experiences of the past. So it still comes back down to reprogramming the way that you interpret your past, because it's not the events that happen to you, it's the meaning that you attach to them.
Interesting. Thank you.
Do you think we are more anxious and depressed than in earlier days, or are we just more likely to admit it, more open to admitting that we are anxious and depressed and therefore seeking help for it?
I think it's a combination of both. On the one side, clearly the diagnostic procedures are very different. If you look at the DSM manuals, the manuals for mental disease, that manual grows physically, every year. So we're beginning to catalogue more and more and more diseases. And there are several people who argue that perhaps things which have now been pathologized as depression, anxiety, are actually really just very normal processes. If you lose a loved one, or you go through a divorce, or you go through a massive traumatic event in your life, of course you're going to be depressed, and you may actually be anxious, but it's a normal process. And with the right support and time, you will actually get out of this process. So a lot of things are pathologized that perhaps once weren't. But I do think that there is a massive increase in the amount of depression and anxiety. And I think, as I said at the beginning, media has a lot to do with this. We are very much controlled by outside influences about what to think, what to worry about, how we're supposed to be, how we're supposed to be perceived. We're all desperate to be accepted, successful, part of a group. And those things can lead to anxiety. And the long and the short of it is we've also got a lot more time for all of the doom and despondency. You know, we live much better lives than we did 50 years ago, let alone 100 years ago. And whereas maybe 100 years ago, the only thing that occupied your mind was where's the next meal going to come from, these days we have a lot more mental space and capacity to worry about things that just didn't occupy our attention. And everybody's very familiar with this idea of looping thoughts or spiraling thoughts, where you start thinking about something and then it comes back, and then it kind of picks up momentum and it gathers more information to confirm this theory that you're having in your mind. And before you know it, you're obsessing about something. Well, you don't have time to obsess about something when you've got to worry about where the next meal is coming from. So I think it's a combination of factors, but that's not to belittle this, because it is a devastating problem and so many people's lives are really, really affected by it.
And what's the way out? What would be your advice to people who are suffering from this kind of issue?
Don't watch the news. It's very difficult, I think. I think we all want to be very well-informed human beings, but I personally stopped watching the news and listening to the news a long time ago, and I feel much happier as a result of it. You know, the important information always filters through, but I think you have to realize that there's just a lot of stuff that is not worth getting upset about. Now, that sounds very easy. And clearly, a lot of us are going to need support and help and therapy to understand and learn the tools of how to deal with these kind of negative impacting thoughts that we have. But I think that we are in a society these days, certainly in the Western world, where we are encouraged to not feel enough, to not feel good enough, to not feel that we have enough, to not feel that we are enough, to not feel that we're successful enough. And, you know, all of those things contribute to our anxiety. And just understanding sometimes that those are external constructs can go a long way. But it's a very individual thing. And there's no answer that's going to suit everybody, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you very much. And I have another question, of course. When you answered the pre-interview questionnaire, you said that your biggest aha moment was when you realized that you are not your past history. Could you share a little bit more about this part, why it's the biggest aha moment for you and why it's so important for you?
This is something that really, really struck me. I first came across this kind of idea about 30 years ago, but I never really sort of took it up and thought more of it. I started to focus a lot more on this when I retrained as a hypnotherapist, when I suddenly began to realize so much of who I think I am and my personality is actually a result of this programming that and that comes from when we're very young children. We're very impressionable up until about the age of 6 or 7. Children essentially operate almost entirely in the subconscious. They have very little, if any, idea of self. That starts to develop a little later than that. The Jesuits, for example, always said, you know, give me a child until the age of 7 and I will show you the man, because they understood these formative years are so important. And it doesn't always have to be trauma. Sometimes it can just be little things. But, you know, if you grow up in a situation where, you know, my father, for example, was a very loving and wonderful parent, but he was also incredibly strict. And one of the things that he also really focused on was he hated people who showed off. So as a child, I was always discouraged from being the center of attention, from showing off. And, you know, and that led much later on to me actually being kind of like not particularly confident and feeling very uncomfortable standing on a stage and, you know, being the person that other people are listening to. And so things like that started to dawn on me when I started to learn about how the past really influences. And when you realize you just don't have to hold on to those programs and you can let them go, you actually have the ability to start your life new almost every single day. And you find that certain things which you thought were part of your personality don't necessarily have to be. And you can change your past and you can change who you are. You can't change the events, but you can certainly change the way you feel about them.
Yes, that's true. Thank you. That's great. Thank you. Could you share, please, something about you which would surprise our listeners?
Gosh, what would surprise your listeners? I tango. I'm a passionate tango dancer.
Oh.
Is that surprising enough? It's got nothing to do with my interests in medicine. But
what do you like the most in tango?
I love the tango because it's very unlike any other dance, which is that it's not really choreographed. So it involves a breaking down of barriers between you and your partner, because the leader leads every single step and the follower cannot predict what that's going to be. So it forces you to let everything around you go and really focus on your partner and focus on the moment. And I find that exciting, liberating, and something we should all find a way of doing, is to get out of our own heads a little bit sometimes and just focus on the now.
Wow.
Would you qualify that as a form of meditation to do the tango?
Yes, in a way it is. It's exactly what it is. I think anything that brings you into the now and stops you succumbing to that internal chatter is a meditative process. Absolutely.
Okay. Your pre-entry questionnaire said that one of your personal habits or daily routines is meditation.
Absolutely.
And so if it's not tango, what kind of meditation do you practice?
Well, there's a million different types of meditation, and I've gone through several different iterations of that. I started off with very sort of classical, trying to focus on the breath and clear the mind. And I find that sometimes that works and sometimes it doesn't. I did that for quite a long time, and I noticed a very positive effect on my life, but I didn't feel that I was getting all out of it that I could do. More recently, I've been very influenced by the work of Dr. Joe Dispenza, and he focuses very much on using more guided meditations, but also allowing you this space to try and calm down and just be without allowing external thoughts, but also using the meditative state to kind of visualize what you want out of your day or your life or your whatever. And I find that very concentrated focus in a meditative state is very good for doing that. So yeah, that's what I choose. But I would never say that any one method is better than another. Again, I think it's a very personal choice.
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank you. I would like to ask you about the things which you value the most in your life. What are your values? Would you share with us, please?
I think, values is always a difficult one. I have very, very strong core values. One of them is integrity. I think it's very important to maintain integrity, and I try and do that as much as I possibly can. Another thing is that I have learned that you cannot possibly be of use to any other person on this planet until you have a good relationship with yourself. So I think that's one of my values, is always to stop and check in with myself, what my motivation for doing something is, what's my reason, end goals, check in with my moral compass. Because unless I'm good with me, I'm not going to be able to interact well with other people.
Right.
And another one of my values is to inspire through not being judgmental, and to try and share what I can to help other people on their way. Because I think at the end of the day, and after several years on this planet, I've begun to understand that true fulfillment it really only comes from service, and that when you serve others, you serve yourself. But you can't do that if you're judgmental. So I try very hard to
not to judge.
suspend judgment, but so it's a value, and it's also a bit of a dream, because I think it's very difficult to do all of the time.
Okay, thank you very much for sharing. And I know also that you're host of London Hill podcast. Could
That's
you
right.
share a little bit more about this part of your journey, your business, your interests with us and our listeners, please?
Yes, so as I mentioned, my interest in mind, body, spirit medicine, and there are very many podcasts out there which cover alternative medicine and naturopathic approaches. There are some very inspired new podcasts, such as your own, which looks at more newer inventions and ideas to break and shift paradigms. And there are also a lot which focus very much on new science and medicine, but I felt that there was a gap in the market for someone who looks at all of that at the same time. And whilst every marketing expert will tell you that's not niched enough, actually I think it is. I think it's a niche in itself, because I point blank refuse to move my feet out of these two camps. So I would maintain my foot in a scientific camp, and I maintain my other foot in a more kind of holistic approach, because I think that that's the future of medicine. I think it's clear that the further that we move away from being in tune with nature and being more in tune with how these bodies were constructed to function, that the sicker we get. But I also completely understand that we live in a world where people need to understand, and they need to explain, and they need to communicate these ideas. And you can only do that with science. That is the new language, because science strips away any kind of ethnic boundaries, or belief boundaries or whatever. It just is. It's the science of life. It's the language that we use to describe what is. And so I think it's very valid, and it's very nice when you can support ideas or theories with scientific data. I don't personally think it's necessary, but it's something which I think certainly puts a label of credibility on that, and it's the future. It's the way, people want things dressed up in science, but there's no reason why we can't look at more mind-body medicine with a scientific backdrop. I think that's completely doable, and that's what I'm trying to do.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. I have a question. Would you share with us, what is one biggest challenge do you have currently in your business, in your podcast?
Well, I think that's exactly it. I just really sort of made it clear, because I do have this spectrum of from the almost woo-woo at one end, all the way to kind of hard science on the other end. And I'm very interested in providing my listeners with source knowledge. So I like to go to the people who have these ideas. And sometimes it's very difficult to persuade scientists to come on a podcast, which has got a lot of naturopathic stuff. And the reverse is also true, because trust me, naturopaths can be just as militant as scientists, if not often more so. So it's difficult sometimes to kind of, bridge that gap. But, I keep fighting, and I think I've managed to get some great guests in the past, and hopefully more in the future. But it's not easy.
Yes, I can imagine. Thank you for your work, for trying to fuse those two approaches.
Thank you, and to you too. I think what you're doing is also wonderful.
Yeah, thank you. Okay. Can you please share with us your plans, maybe for the next 5 or 10 years?
Well, I have a dream. I wouldn't say it's a plan. So my dream is at some point to actually be able to open a clinic, which is based on a truly integrative approach, so that when a person comes in, they're not just looked at by a GP who has, their standard operating procedures and guidelines, but somebody who, first of all, takes the time to actually get to know the client, the patient, and their problems, and also then be able to funnel them to the right place to go, and also not understanding rather that maybe one place to go is not necessarily the sum total of it. So if a client comes in with a problem, perhaps they need the intervention of a physician, perhaps they need the intervention of a naturopath, perhaps they also need the support of a therapist. They should be able to get all of those things, so that instead of ameliorating symptoms, which is what we do these days, we put band-aids on things and send people away and manage disease. I want to encourage health and wellness, because wellness is the way we are supposed to be. We're not supposed to survive. We're supposed to even thrive and into old age healthily. But you can only do that when you really understand that you need to look after your mind, your body, and your spirit. And when that's offered to you as a client, because a lot of, that's the negative side of science, is that it's so complicated that the man in the street feels that they are literally cut off from that avenue. So they go to a doctor and they put the responsibility for their healthcare in the hands of this other person and trust that other person knows best. So wouldn't it be great if we could have a situation where we start to educate people, and we start to encourage them, and we start to empower them to actually take control of their own healthcare and understand that sometimes they need help in a physical context, in a natural context, and also in a mental context. And taking a pill isn't always the best way. Sometimes it is, but it's not always the best way. And I'd like to have that all in a setup which is also affordable. So that's why it's a dream. But that's my long-term goal. And my way there is with the podcast. And I also have access through my hypnotherapy to a very large network, international network of therapists. And of course, therapists are the front line to their clients. And so there's a knock-on effect. So I'm desperately trying to educate therapists too, who perhaps know a lot about what they're doing, therapists of all flavors. But again, if they had up-to-date knowledge, if they had the science, if they had true understanding of medical and mental conditions, whilst it may not alter the way they do their therapy, it certainly encourages trust with their clients. It encourages education. And it means that they can pass on this knowledge to their clients and they pass it on. So it's a knock-on effect. So I see therapists as being fabulous multipliers to be able to get this message out there. So that's my goal, is to try and bring more and more, therapists and health coaches in and get them to understand more and more and help them do their jobs better.
Great. Thank you. It's impressive.
It's a big dream, as I said. But, go big or go home, right?
Yeah. Dreams come true. I'm sorry.
A few minutes ago, you said that it would be good to empower people to take responsibility or ownership of their own health, because the science has become so difficult that they just give up. If somebody is not suggestible to hypnotherapy, how would that person become more suggestible? Let's say somebody's skeptical of hypnosis. How should they become more open to the method?
Well, first of all, hypnotherapy, as I said, is really only one route. There's a lot of ways to skin a cat, but at the end of the day, it's the same cat. So, okay. That's one avenue. And I'm not sure that you can make somebody more suggestible. In my experience, there are people who are more readily hypnotizable than others, but even somebody who's not sort of theoretically suggestible, as long as they're open and they go with the process, they will find they get results. It's not a matter of belief. It's just a matter of not resisting.
Yeah.
So that's one avenue. But I think empowerment is much more than that. I think empowerment is making people understand that there are options and that they have choices. And I think our modern medical profession, partly due to the influences of science, of very much a focus on either surgical interventions or pharmacological interventions as being the only options, a kind of a belittling and dumbing down of a lot of traditional naturopathic approaches. I think they've been very much maligned, but they can be beneficial. And I think just making people aware of the fact that they have choices and that they have the right to exercise those choices. You know, I mean, I always make a point of saying, please don't change any therapeutic procedure or medication regime or anything without consulting your healthcare practitioner. But be aware that maybe that's not the only option and there are other options.
Right.
And so ultimately, you know, London Heal, I'm hoping, will become a bit of a one-stop shop where you can actually go in and look and see, well, you know, what are my options? You know, no, this one doesn't really appeal to me. This one does. And just let people explore. And also you get an amazing feedback loop when somebody acts on their own intention and they get a positive result. That reinforcement empowers them to go on and do more. And you have to find the right people to accompany you on your journey. And that's not always easy.
Oh, that's the hardest part, I think.
Absolutely.
Find such people.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think there are rotten apples that spoil your barrel?
Always. Always. But I think that's true in every walk of life, isn't it?
Right.
I mean, you know, there are charlatans everywhere. And, but I mean, on the other hand, I'm not entirely sure that super regulating everything is the way to get around that problem either, because let's face it, there are charlatans in the medical profession without a shadow of a doubt. We've all come across the bad doctor who really shouldn't be there.
Yes.
And so I think, but that again, you know, is part of empowerment, because if you are empowered and if you know the questions to ask and you know what to look for, then very quickly you as a patient, as a client, can start to sort out, you know, the wheat from the chaff. It becomes easier to spot the charlatans. But the fact that they're out there is indisputable. But as I said, I think that's true really in every walk of life.
Yes, that's true. Yes, and if people would want to contact you, to reach out and contact, how they can do this? What's the best way to do this?
The best way is to contact me via londonheal.com. There you get access to the newsletter and the mailing list, which gives everybody extended podcast notes, because sometimes when we're covering quite complex topics, it's difficult to pick everything up just listening.
Yeah.
And rather than having to go back and listen over and over again, it's not a good business model for me, is it? But to help my listeners, I do release detailed podcast notes every week. So if they subscribe to become a London Heal Insider, they get those every week for free. And sign up to the podcast and check out my Facebook page, which is also under London Heal.
That's great. Thank you. And my second question, my next question, is about failures, because we all experience the times of downfalls and failures in our life. Could you please share your story? What was the biggest failure for you, and how did you manage? How did you cope?
I fail all the time. I mean, all the time. And I think that is the most useful lesson that you can learn in life, is to understand that failures are really just an opportunity to refine the next run. So, you know, in England, they used to have these little toys for children that were weighted at the bottom. So if you tipped them over, they'd pop back up, and they were called Weebles. And the slogan was that Weebles wobble, but they don't fall down. And I think I'm a Weeble. So I fail all the time. I fall flat on my face on a regular basis. But, you know, that's the way I hone and refine, hopefully, the right way to do things and the right path. When I moved back to England, for example, several years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, and decided to give up my classical science career and retrain, I mean, that was a huge risk, and I had no idea whether or not that was going to be the right thing to do. And I knew nothing about running my own business. So I used to make jewelry. So I started off just selling jewelry online because I thought, well, at least this way I'll learn about how to, run an online business. And I made loads of mistakes, but it was painless because it was just a hobby. But I learned so much from that. So I fail all the time. And I think you'll find that most people in life do. The question is, do you let it crush you and stop you going forwards? Or do you say, okay, well, that didn't work. Maybe this will, and try a different approach. So no one big thing, just a constant record of mistakes. But hopefully every now and again, I get it right as well.
That's great. Thank you. And would you share with us your strangest talent? How do you think? What is your strangest talent?
Goodness me, I'm not sure. Actually, I think talents are one of those things that other people tell you that you have and not that you have your own. It's a bit like on Instagram when people say public figure. I always think that's the sort of thing that's a title you should get awarded by other people and not yourself. So it's hard to know, but I think maybe one talent I have, which is perhaps what pushed me a little into going into looking into therapy. Although these days, may I add, I almost have no time to do therapy anymore. But I can usually see into people pretty well. I can read people very well, and I think that is a skill that has put me in good stead over the years. I'm usually pretty good at telling when somebody is not telling me the truth. I always say, don't think so loud, it's rude. Like when somebody's talking to you and you know what they're thinking is something completely different. Yeah. So maybe that's a talent. I don't know.
Is it easy to live with such a talent, or?
No, because quite often, there's a part of you that wants to break with convention and stop being polite and actually tell somebody the truth. But it's not always the right way to go. Yeah, I think it's a talent. Perhaps another skill, I would say, rather than a talent that I've been told that I have is the ability to communicate complex ideas in a way that people can understand them. And that's something that I also get
valuable. Yes.
Well, I also get an immense amount of pleasure out of it because I don't like blinding people with science. I think it's unnecessary. I think some of these concepts can really be very simple and very understandable.
Okay. Did you have a question?
No, you just answered it. I did have a question. The person that you see into, do they have to be physically present, or could it be like?
It's usually just
here now where
it's usually when I'm just talking to people. I mean, as I say, maybe it's not really a talent, and maybe I'm completely wrong on this. It just served me in the past where I've noticed if I get a bit of a hunch that maybe somebody is the way that I think that they are. You see, that's where it comes in what we were talking about before about not being judgmental, because it's very hard not to judge other people that you interact with. But I try and do it in such a way, for example, that if somebody is responding in a really negative way to me, then, I try and listen closely and hear what's really going on. And oftentimes, somebody who's being cross and angry and rude has usually got their own mess going on somewhere. And once you kind of understand that and show them that you understand that, all of a sudden your conversation takes a totally different turn.
Yeah.
You can have a really productive discussion rather than one that's conflictive. So that's something that I would say happens when I'm in somebody's presence and in conversation with them.
Yeah. Okay. Tatiana, and our podcast is and for paradigm shifters. So would you share with us, how do you shift the old paradigm? Once again, maybe like a resume. And
Well, I think it's a question of shifting it back, actually, because the paradigm used to be that we all understood that living in harmony with nature and treating our mind, body, and spirit in the way that it was intended was the right way to go. And that changed, a couple of 100 years ago. So if anything, rather than breaking an old paradigm, it's a question of shifting back to the original one. So that's how I see my work is don't be fooled that progress means that we have all the answers, because actually it's in some ways blinkering us to answers that we already used to have. We've just chosen to ignore them.
I have a comment or maybe a question about that. Back in the old days, like you're referring to, they still had the same amount of time in a day, and they could ingest the same amount of information. But I think the type of information we're getting these days just splinters our minds and makes us aware and conscious and thinking of things that don't really matter. Have you seen a shift like this, especially with our smartphones? We're getting all this information that
Definitely.
fast food for our minds, but is that something that you're noticing? And
definitely, and I think that causes an immense amount of fragmentation. I mean,
fragmentation. Thank you.
they say that if you look back at old societies, the average size of a village was usually around 100 to 150 people, and there's good reason for that, because you can actually only maintain meaningful relationships with a maximum of about 150 people. Beyond that, it becomes, you just can't handle it as an individual. And the same is true to a certain degree, I think, of information. There's only just a certain amount that we can deal with, and everything over that just leads to confusion and noise. And I actually interviewed Dr. Mike Merzenich, who is the kind of father of neuroplasticity. And he was saying that this noise that builds up, and this noise can be on several levels. It can be, years and years of acquired experience and learning and function, but it's also information, it's everything. The brain cannot function in a coherent fashion when it's literally fighting on 50 different fronts at the same time. So I think it's very important that we understand that there is an endless amount of information out there, but only some of it is relevant. And I think the key is to encourage people to refine their own filters, if you like, and let in what's valid and don't let in what isn't. And for heaven's sake, don't go down the road of feeling yourself or evaluating your sense of self-worth by how people judge you on social media, because I think a lot of young people, unfortunately, do fall into that. They are however many clicks they get, and that's not who you are.
Yeah, that's true. Tatiana, how do you think, are there things you would do differently in your life from the perspective of nowadays?
No, I don't think so. I think anybody who says they would do differently is probably not really being 100% honest. There are things that I've experienced and decisions I've made, which perhaps were not the optimal decision and could go back and be optimized. But I really believe that we are all where we're supposed to be on our respective journeys. And I take everything as a learning experience, and I wouldn't change anything, and I wouldn't change society either, because I think that works on the micro scale of you yourself, but it works on the macro scale too, which is, the world around us looks like it's falling into chaos, and it is, but maybe it's time for that. Maybe that's how we get a paradigm shift. Maybe you have to break down the old to get to the new. So no, I wouldn't change a thing.
Would you share with us, what is your mission?
My mission is to empower people to take back control of their lives, actually, their healthcare, their welfare, and their lives, because your life is yours to live, and you should thrive, not just survive. And that's in your hands. It's not up to anyone else.
Yeah. And I have one more question. Would you share with us your advice? What kind of advice would you give to the younger generation, to the generation that comes after us? Because they are the creators of the future life. So
Yeah.
Advice.
I actually have less concerns about the future than a lot of people. I have a daughter who is 19, and I find that when I look at her and her generation, there's a part of me that just thinks, oh God, just as long as we don't screw it up before they take over. Because I actually think that that generation of people have a lot to offer. They grew up in a society very different from ours. They've grown up understanding that things like tolerance is important, that diversity is important, that environmental consciousness is important, that respecting other people is important. Now, that may not be across the board. Perhaps it's just a particular demographic.
Yes.
But it's certainly a demographic that perhaps are going to be the rulers of tomorrow. And my advice my advice would be only that which I give to my daughter, which is be true to yourself. Everybody has a moral compass, think about what makes you happy. I'm not a particular Christian, but in the Bible, one of the 10 commandments is do to others as you would, be done unto yourself. And that is my advice, is use your own moral compass and think about how you interact with other people and what effect your words and your actions have on others, and think about how you would feel if that was done back to you. I think that's a good place to start.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's very useful, and
I think that's the most useful part of the Bible, in my opinion. It's the golden rule.
Yes, I have one more question, and this question is there anything we didn't ask you about, but maybe you would like to talk about? Because we were trying to cover everything to make a big picture of you and what are you doing, but maybe there is something we missed.
No, I think we pretty much covered everything, other than, as I said, I have a great desire that people don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, that in the face of progress and technology, that sometimes what we used to know is very valid and worth revisiting. And as I said, the more and more and more I understand about the science of how our bodies and our brains work, the more I realize that Mother Nature really knows what she was doing. And that the further we get away and we isolate ourselves in this information forest, in a box that we call our home, that's with no sunlight, with no trees, with no nature, with no anything, that this is not going to go well. Because we've only been around in our present form for a couple of 100,000 years, and when you think about how our society has changed just in the last 100 years, it's a lot to expect our physiology to keep up with that rate of change, and do it successfully. So sometimes the old isn't as bad as everyone thinks it is, but the new is very important, because that way we can understand it and we can describe it and we can communicate it, and that's very important too.
Yes, thank you very much for such a great interview.
Thank you.
Lots of useful information for us and our listeners too. It was our pleasure to meet you here.
The pleasure was all mine. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Great pleasure.